Right now, foreign investors control 50 million hectares of Australian agricultural land. That's 13% of the entire country's farmland. And the money keeps flowing in. Canadian pension funds are dropping $500 million on single agricultural properties. Chinese investors, British billionaires, Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds, they're all bidding against Australian family farmers for the same land. The Australian rancher, who's owned their property for 3 generations, can't compete with institutional capital that doesn't need the farm to be profitable tomorrow. They just need it to exist in 50 years. And one by one, family farms are disappearing from the auction block, not because they're failing, but because they can't afford to survive their own success. The numbers tell a story that Australian agriculture is being systematically rewired. As of June 2025, 50.26 million hectares of productive agricultural land has passed into foreign hands. To put that in perspective, that's equivalent to more than 70% of the entire United Kingdom's total land area, all dedicated to agriculture, all owned by people and institutions with no generational connection to Australian soil. This isn't speculation. This isn't projection. This is registered data, tabled in the Australian Federal Parliament. 73 countries now hold registered interests in Australian farmland, but the concentration at the top tells the real story. The United Kingdom leads with 7.664 million hectares. China comes second with 6.537 million hectares. Canada holds 4.928 million hectares. And these numbers are climbing steadily, year after year, quarter after quarter, with no sign of slowing down. What makes this crisis invisible to most Australians is the structural nature of the acquisition. Foreign investors rarely announce themselves. They don't hold press conferences. Instead, they work through layers of corporate entities, subsidiary companies, and financial structures so complex that ownership becomes opaque. A Canadian pension fund manages the retirement income of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and Canadian military personnel. That same pension fund, through companies with names like Daybreak Cropping, Australian Food and Fibre, and Aurora Dairies, now controls some of Australia's most productive agricultural land. In one transaction in 2025, that single Canadian investor, PSP Investments, acquired $500 million worth of agricultural property called the Kuba Aggregation. Located between Griffith and Darlington Point in New South Wales, it's a high-value hub for cotton, irrigated row crops, and livestock, complete with massive water entitlements from the Murrumbidgee River. One transaction. $500 million gone from Australian ownership. The deal closed quietly, processed through legal channels designed to facilitate exactly this type of large-scale acquisition. No local farmer could have bid against it. No regional cooperative could have matched the capital. The auction process, designed to protect Australian interests by requiring open and transparent sale procedures, instead functioned to ensure that only the highest bidder won, and the highest bidder was institutional capital from Toronto. But the real shock isn't the size of individual deals, it's the concentration. Livestock accounts for 87% of all foreign-held agricultural land in Australia. That's 45 million hectares dedicated to cattle, sheep, and other livestock operations. These aren't hobby operations or speculative bets on future land values. These are the industrial backbone of Australian beef and lamb exports, and they're increasingly controlled by entities whose shareholders will never set foot on the property. A British billionaire's hedge fund doesn't care if a Queensland cattle station has been in the same family for 8 decades. What matters is the annual return on capital and the long-term appreciation of the underlying asset. If institutional investors can increase productivity by consolidating operations, eliminating smaller competitors, and applying industrial management techniques, then family farms become obstacles rather than assets. The emotional connection that a family farmer has to their land, the respect for traditional farming practices, the commitment to soil stewardship across generations. These are liabilities in a capital optimization framework. They reduce efficiency, slow decision-making, and prevent the ruthless consolidation that generates superior returns. This is why institutional investors systematically acquire family farms, not to preserve them, but to disassemble them, incorporating their best assets into larger operations and eliminating the redundancy. The geography of this takeover reveals something crucial. The Northern Territory holds the highest concentration of foreign ownership at 27.8% of all agricultural land in the territory. Queensland comes second, with foreign investors holding interests in 17.1 million hectares. Western Australia is third with 11.5 million hectares. Together, these 3 states account for 86% of all foreign-held agricultural land in Australia. This matters because these are exactly the regions where Australian family farmers are most established and most vulnerable. The Northern Territory's pastoral industry was built on generations of station families learning how to manage livestock in extreme climates. Queensland's beef industry is a cultural institution spanning multiple generations of family operations. Western Australia's grazing landscape was pioneered by families who understood the specific ecology and weather patterns across vast distances. Now, those exact regions are being systematically acquired by foreign capital. The mechanics of foreign land ownership in Australia are theoretically regulated. Any foreign acquisition of agricultural land valued above $15 million requires approval from the Foreign Investment Review Board, known as FIRB. The government's stated policy is to require an open and transparent sale process, but in practice, institutional investors with sophisticated legal structures can navigate these requirements with ease. They have armies of lawyers, financial advisors, and land agents who understand exactly how to structure deals to meet government requirements while maximizing their position. A small family farm selling their operation has none of that infrastructure. They have a local real estate agent and a bank manager. The asymmetry of resources is absolute. Consider what happened with Aruna Station in the Northern Territory. The property had been owned by the South Australian DeGiorgio family, who purchased it in 2021 for $22.75 million. Before that, it was owned by Gina Reinhardt's Hancock Prospecting, acquired in 2017 for $13.5 million. Now, a South American family called the Buratovich family, whose agricultural operations span multiple countries and span more than a century, producing wheat, barley, peas, lentils, sorghum, and cotton across multiple international markets, has acquired it. This is the fifth Northern Territory property they've purchased. Their total landholding in the territory is now 756,000 hectares. For context, that's larger than several Australian states. Their acquisition strategy is deliberate and methodical. Buy established, productive properties with demonstrated operational success, consolidate them into a larger regional operation. Apply modern management techniques sourced from their international experience. Invest capital in improvements like fencing, yards, and water systems, and watch the asset appreciate as a unified entity rather than fragmented operations. The local family farmer with inherited knowledge of the territory but limited capital has no chance competing in this market structure. Aruna Station itself benefited from average annual rainfall of 900 millimeters and extensive natural water resources from the Flora River and Matheson Creek, making it valuable grazing land. But the value extraction happened through a corporate acquisition that removed it from local ownership entirely. The scale of foreign investment in 2025 alone exceeded $7.1 billion, flowing into Australian agricultural properties. That's not capital searching for yield in the share market or speculative returns in real estate. That's long-term capital, patient capital, institutional capital, making deliberate decisions to own the land beneath Australian agriculture. A wave of fresh capital has emerged from German, Italian, and British investors, alongside private wealth from family offices in Spain and France. Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds, particularly from Qatar and Saudi Arabia, have been active since 2012, when the Saudi Agricultural and Livestock Investment Company made its first acquisition in Australia, purchasing 200,000 hectares, including 40,000 merino sheep. Qatar-backed Hassad Australia operates 9 farms across 152,000 hectares, producing hundreds of thousands of tons of grain and raising 160,000 head of sheep annually. These aren't small players or marginal investors. These are state-backed capital vehicles making permanent claims on Australian productive capacity. The Australian dollar trading in the mid-60s has made Australian farmland extraordinarily attractive to foreign investors. When your home currency is strong and the Australian dollar is weak, agricultural land represents an exceptional value proposition. You're buying productive assets at a discount while betting on both agricultural commodity price appreciation and currency appreciation. For a Canadian pension fund or a British investment firm, Australian agricultural land represents geographic diversification, currency, diversification, and commodity production risk hedging all in a single asset class. They don't need the farm to generate 10% annual returns. 5% returns on appreciating land values with zero currency risk is plenty. That's exactly what family farmers can't offer. They need cash flow today because they have debt servicing requirements, operating expenses, and equipment replacement costs. But here's where the story becomes genuinely tragic for Australian ranching families. The farmland boom itself is pricing them out. Between 2010 and 2025, Australian farmland values nearly tripled. A property that was worth $5 million in 2010 is worth $15 million today. For foreign investors and institutional capital, that's wonderful. The asset is appreciating rapidly, and they have unlimited patient capital. For an Australian farmer trying to pass the property to the next generation, it's a catastrophe. Your child inherits not an opportunity, but a financial prison. The land is now valued at $15 million. If you want to pass it to your daughter, she has 3 options. Option 1, she buys out her siblings, taking on millions of dollars in debt while also inheriting farm debt. Option 2, she sells the land and doesn't inherit anything. Option 3, she walks away from farming entirely. Farm succession in Australia is now a crisis. Only 14% of dairy farmers in Victoria have finalized a succession plan. The rest are paralyzed by the mathematics of inheritance. The family farm, once a path to generational wealth and security, has become a path to generational debt. Charles Sturt University conducted research on farmers who successfully navigated succession, and the findings are bleak. One farmer described the experience as 20 years of hell, typically involving profound family conflict, disagreements over valuation, disputes between siblings, and emotional wounds that never fully heal. In dozens of interviews across Australia, farmers and their families identify succession as their biggest challenge. Not drought, not commodity prices, not climate change. The single greatest threat to their future is the question of who gets the farm and whether that person can afford to keep it. The debt burden makes this crisis worse. The average Australian farm now carries debt of $1.1 million, nearly double what it was a decade earlier. This debt exists because farms need to scale to be viable. The Australian government provides virtually no subsidies to farmers, about a fifth the level of Canada and the United States, and a tenth of the European Union. That means Australian farms have to be ruthlessly efficient and massively scaled to compete globally. A farm with 2,000 hectares and basic equipment simply cannot compete with a farm with 5,000 hectares and modern technology. So farmers borrow to expand, they borrow to buy equipment, they borrow to acquire neighboring properties when they come on the market. By the time their children are old enough to inherit, the average farm carries $1.1 million in debt. Now layer this on top of rising land values. The farm is worth more, but the debt is the same. The child inheriting the farm looks at the balance sheet and sees a theoretical asset that's worth $15 million, but is encumbered by debt and requires constant borrowing just to remain operational. The mathematics are brutal. Even if the farm is profitable, the return on capital doesn't justify the risk. A young person could walk away from farming, invest the inheritance in property development or share markets, and generate more wealth with less risk and less work. So they do. And when the farm goes on the market, the buyer is usually foreign capital or a massive domestic agricultural corporation. The property is removed from family ownership and consolidated into a larger operation. The result is a structural change in Australian agriculture that's becoming permanent. Large farms are getting larger. Corporate and institutional ownership is consolidating. Family farms are being consolidated into bigger operations or sold to foreign investors. The Penfold family of Queensland provides a window into how this plays out. Dan Penfold started with 500 cattle and $20,000 in the bank, plus debt on leasehold land. He built that into a sprawling operation through years of work, careful management, and reinvestment of profits back into the business. But the succession question haunted him. When his children were old enough to inherit, the question wasn't whether they wanted to farm. It was whether they could afford the debt required to keep farming. The land that Dan built was now valued at multiples of what he originally invested, which meant his heirs would inherit both an opportunity and a crushing financial burden. The family's wife, Karen, has now become a spokesperson traveling the country trying to convince farmers that there's another path forward that doesn't require selling to institutional investors. But her fear is visceral and explicit. What will happen is we will lose all family farms, and corporate agi will be the only one, and then the passion is lost. That passion is what foreign investors don't understand and why they don't care. They're not buying agricultural land for passion. They're buying it for yield, for diversification, for asset appreciation, and for the security of owning something productive in a geopolitically stable country. An Australian rancher loves the land in a way that a Canadian pension fund never will. That rancher knows the country, understands the seasons, respects the ecology, and builds their identity around stewardship of the property. A pension fund sees a cash flow engine. The difference matters more than it appears. When a family farmer makes a decision about how to manage the land, they consider the long-term health of the soil, water, biodiversity, and their community. When a pension fund makes decisions about land management, they consider how to maximize output and minimize costs. These aren't compatible value systems, and they lead to fundamentally different outcomes. The investment case for foreign capital is compelling, which is exactly why it keeps flowing in. Australia is geopolitically stable, has rule of law, has well-established property rights protections, and faces extremely low transaction and regulatory costs for agricultural land acquisition. The state government essentially promotes and provides the regulatory framework for marketization and assetization in agriculture. That means buying up farmland and consolidating it into larger operations is structurally easy. It's also profitable. A Canadian pension fund acquiring the Cuba aggregation isn't gambling. It's a calculated investment in productive assets that will generate returns for decades. The property produces cotton, irrigated row crops, and livestock. All three are commodities with global demand. The water entitlements from the Murrumbidgee River provide irrigation security that many farmers can only dream about. From an investment standpoint, it's a near-perfect asset. What's invisible in this calculus is the generational displacement of Australian farming families. When that property changed hands, it wasn't sold at market price by a family that desperately wanted to stay but couldn't afford to. It was sold by owners who understood that in a market where foreign capital competes for assets, the selling price reflects the maximum someone with unlimited capital is willing to pay. An Australian farming family operating that same property might generate 5% annual returns and sleep well. A foreign investor generating 5% returns while the underlying asset appreciates at 3% annually is generating 8% total returns, which is attractive. That investor will pay a price that reflects those return assumptions. The Australian family, which needs 7% returns just to service their debt and fund equipment replacement, can't compete. Regional divergence is becoming pronounced as a result. Western Australia bucked national trends with 18.7% farmland value growth in 2024, benefiting from strong winter crop conditions and high rainfall. By contrast, New South Wales experienced a sharp 24.4% correction that wiped out much of its recent gains. The Northern Territory saw median prices fall 24.2% in the first half of 2025, with Tasmania falling 20.1%. Victoria and South Australia are experiencing severe drought conditions that restrict the capital available to farmers wanting to expand. What this means in practice is that foreign investors are cherry-picking the best-performing regions, while Australian farmers in struggling regions face margin compression and forced sales. The consolidation accelerates in exactly the regions where it's least sustainable. Dairy farmers in Victoria are particularly vulnerable. Only 14% of Western Victorian dairy farms have finalized succession plans. The rest are caught between rising land values, compressed milk margins, and debt loads that make expansion impossible. A milk price rise announced in late 2025 by Australian Dairy Farmers Corporation was welcome because it temporarily met production costs, but it did nothing to address the underlying issue. Farms need to scale to be viable, but scaling requires capital they don't have, and when they try to raise that capital by borrowing, they're making assumptions about future milk prices, commodity costs, and input prices that are increasingly uncertain. One dairy farmer reported spending $115 per month per cow on winter feed in 2025, when the historical cost was $80 per month. That's a 75% increase in a single winter. If that happens again in 2026, farms go bankrupt. The solution isn't productivity improvements, it's scale. But achieving scale requires capital, and capital increasingly comes from foreign investors. The consolidation is also being driven by what's known as corporate aggregation, where investors systematically purchase multiple properties in the same region and combine them into larger operations. The Buratovich family exemplifies this strategy. They've purchased Aruna Station in the Northern Territory, plus Scott Creek, Manbaloo, and Sturt Downs, which they bought in 2019 for a combined $43 million, plus Stapleton Station in 2021 for $7.3 million. Their total landholding in the Northern Territory is now 756,000 hectares. Each individual property might have been sustainable and profitable as a family operation. Combined into a larger corporate structure with professional management, access to capital for equipment and improvements, and economies of scale, it becomes a far more efficient operation. A family farm with 50,000 hectares can't compete with a corporate operation with 200,000 hectares and centralized management infrastructure. What's happening in livestock operations is happening in all agricultural sectors where foreign investment is active. Cropping land represents 3.4 million hectares of foreign-owned property. Horticulture accounts for 184,000 hectares. Forestry accounts for 1.5 million hectares. This sector is growing rapidly as investors recognize the key intersection of agricultural production and carbon credit generation. These aren't accidental acquisitions. They're deliberate investment strategies targeting sectors with demonstrable returns and commodity demand. A European investor interested in carbon farming now finds Australian forestry land offering both timber production and carbon sequestration rights. That's a compound return mechanism that a family farmer operating a forestry operation simply can't match from a capital availability perspective. The transaction volumes themselves tell the story of a market in transition. After peaking at over 10,500 sales in 2021, the market recorded just 5,408 transactions in 2025. That's a 50% decline in 5 years. The explanation is that elevated interest rates kept buyers cautious, but it's also a structural change. Large institutional investors don't transact frequently. They're playing a multi-decade game. Once they acquire a property, they hold it, improve it, and watch the asset appreciate. Family farmers, by contrast, exit the market when they can't service debt or when they need to fund succession. So fewer transactions means less activity from the owner-operator segment and relatively more stability from the institutional investor segment. Each time a property is removed from family ownership and consolidated into corporate ownership, the next transaction becomes even less likely. The market is literally shrinking in transaction volume as consolidation proceeds. The Australian government's policy response has been modest. FIRB approval requirements theoretically slow foreign acquisition, but in practice, sophisticated investors navigate these requirements with ease. The requirement for an open and transparent sale process actually accelerates foreign investment because it ensures the highest bidder wins, and the highest bidder is usually foreign capital with deep balance sheets. Australian family farmers need leverage, need creative financing, need owner financing, or deferred payment structures. But a FIRB-mandated open auction process eliminates these options and goes directly to the highest cash price. This policy, nominally designed to protect Australian interests, actually accelerates foreign ownership concentration. Some pushback has emerged. The Lowy Institute conducted a poll showing 80% of Australians oppose foreign investors buying Australian land. But public opposition and government policy are decoupled. The government maintains a liberal policy framework because it maximizes investment flows, broadens the tax base, and generates employment in agricultural services and equipment sectors. From a narrow economic perspective, foreign investment in Australian agriculture is beneficial. It brings capital, improves efficiency, and maintains export competitiveness. The cost, which is invisible in GDP figures, is the displacement of generational farming families and the concentration of agricultural control in foreign hands. Some Australian families are fighting back through repurchase. The Macmillan Pastoral Company bought back Wollongong Station and Wentworth Station from Chinese billionaire Ma Xingfa in 2020 for $53 million, adding almost 700,000 hectares to their holdings. Ian and Camilla Shippen paid $37 million for MT Finance, one of the largest agricultural holdings in Victoria's Western District, from Hafco, a Chinese-Australian joint venture. The McBride family, South Australian wool growers, paid $70 million for Telapia Downs Station from Qatar-backed Hassad Australia. These are exceptions, and they're only possible for large, well-capitalized family operations. The small to medium-sized farm with genuine economic viability but constrained capital availability has no path to survival in a market dominated by foreign bidders. The pattern emerging across Australian agriculture is clear. Regional areas where foreign investment is concentrated will increasingly be owned, operated, and managed by entities headquartered outside Australia. Management decisions will be made based on capital returns rather than community benefit. The ecological stewardship that comes from multi-generational family ownership will be replaced by operational efficiency. The cultural identity of regional communities, which is rooted in family farming traditions, will hollow out as farms consolidate and employment centralizes. Schools will close as children leave rural areas. Towns will shrink. The social fabric that makes rural Australia viable will fray. But the most profound loss is agency. An Australian family farm operates according to principles that reflect the values, knowledge, and judgment of the operating family. A foreign-owned corporate operation operates according to principles that reflect the financial requirements of the parent entity. When all the major agricultural assets in a region are owned by foreign institutional investors, the region loses control over its own future. Decisions about how much to invest in soil health, water conservation, biodiversity management, and community contribution are made in Toronto, London, Beijing, or Paris. This isn't always sinister or catastrophic, but it's always extractive. The primary purpose is return on capital, not community well-being. The transformation of Australian agriculture from family-owned to institutionally owned is largely irreversible. Once a farm is sold to a large corporation or foreign investor and consolidated into a larger operation, it almost never returns to family ownership. The capital required to reverse the consolidation is simply unavailable. So the next decade will see accelerating consolidation as more family farms reach succession crises and more generational transitions force sales into a market where foreign capital dominates. The Australian rancher, who could compete in a market of other family farmers, cannot compete in a market where the buyers are Canadian pension funds, British billionaires, and Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds. What's being lost is the independence of Australian agriculture. The farms will still produce beef, lamb, wool, cotton, and grain. The exports will still flow. The economic contribution will still be significant. But the decision-making authority over how Australian agricultural land is used, when and for what purposes, will increasingly reside outside Australia. That's what 50 million hectares in foreign hands means. It's not just land, it's control, it's sovereignty over productive capacity. And for the Australian rancher watching this happen, it means watching their future disappear into a global capital system that doesn't care about their family, their tradition, or their community. It only cares about the numbers on a spreadsheet. And on those spreadsheets, Australian family farms simply don't compute. The foreign investor doesn't owe anything to the country that produced them or the communities that supported them. The debt flows to Toronto. The profits flow to London. The decisions flow from capital, not from connection to soil, community, or country.